Okay, now that we've got it all laid out here, let's go ahead and talk about what comes in the master rebuild kit. So on this side, I've got the throttle assemblies. You've got the funky looking toothed washers to keep them aligned. You got seals for both sides, throttle shaft, new valve. The one that I got has the poppet valves, or the new throttle blade. The one that I got has the new poppet valves in it. Not sure if I'm going to keep them, solder them up. Not sure yet. Also screws to attach it. New float needle seat ×2. All the throttle stuff ×2. These are for the choke or the enrichment device shaft. And then you have a ton of extra seals, some of which we'll figure out as we reassemble. A couple I can let you know. These seal the enrichment device mechanism into the side of the carburetor. These go on the main jet seat. So on this seat for this guy, you're going to have seals for both your mixture screw and for your the float shaft screw, and then caps for the outside of the enrichment screw, seals for that, the O-rings and whatnot. Down here you just have all of your seals for the carburetors. So to the air cleaner, to the spacer, to the carburetor from the spacer. So this is what's included in the master kit. I will most likely be using everything on here except for the throttle shaft bushings. There wasn't that much play in mine, and you need a special reamer tool, and it's just a mess to do that. So I think I'm going to skip that part, and we're just going to install the rest of this. Oh, and these are for the float bowl. So that is the totality of what comes in the master rebuild kit. Fortunately, you also get a fancy instruction manual, step-by-step-ish guide to going through it. Hopefully the video I'm making right now will help you complement this guide and kind of show any difficult areas or areas that you might need to take extra time. And between the two of them, hopefully your carb rebuilds goes a lot smoother than mine will.
Before we start reassembly, I wanted to just touch on cleaning a bit. After reading or watching some stuff on the internet, I ended up using a degreaser, like a Purple Power kind of thing, in the ultrasonic cleaner. Don't do that because what I realized is that those degreasers actually eat aluminum. So what ended up happening is I ended up with this white fuzzy stuff all over the carb body and all of the aluminum parts. For all the metal parts, I soak them in vinegar. You can use vinegar. You can use any kind of rust dissolving solution. There's a bunch of them that are reusable and whatnot. So once you take it out of there, you are going to want to wipe it off immediately and probably coat it in something. This is the one acceptable use for WD-40, water displacement. It's not a lubricant. So I'm going to also use some light motor oil to kind of just rub just a very, very light coating on some parts as we reassemble. But I went through and I used sanding paper and sponges and stuff to clean all this stuff up. When you're doing that, if it is these brass pieces, they are softer. Use a very, very fine grit of sandpaper. I was using 1500. Don't use anything more coarse than like 1000 or 1500 grit because you will just score right into these brass pieces. For the steel pieces, the linkage plates and whatnot, it doesn't matter quite as much. And I used some more coarse grit sandpaper. But cleaned all that stuff up. Because of the degreaser that I used and the weird fuzziness that it left all over the carburetor body, what I ended up doing is I had one of those hopper style sandblasters from Harbor Freight. I loaded it up with just a very fine media, and I blasted the outside of the carburetor body. And then I taped it off, and I got some satin clear from Rust-Oleum. Their 2X line is amazing, and I just shot 2 coats of their satin clear on the body of the carburetor, and I think it looks fantastic. And the bottom plate for the float bowl. I'm still not sure what I'm going to do about the dash pot cover. It's not in the greatest condition. They do make covers, but I think that's kind of cheesy. So what I may end up doing is chucking this up in a buddy's lathe and running some emery paper or something on it to try and polish up some of these little imperfections and whatnot in the dash pot cover. But I can do that later, because that's 3 screws to remove it, and you can take it on and off as many times as you want. You can see here I have all of my parts laid out in the order in which they go. If you took enough pictures, you should be able to kind of get this for yourself. If you didn't take enough pictures, you bought the carb rebuild kit, right? Oh, look, it's all right there. You can look at the carb rebuild kit instructions, and you can completely recreate the order in which the stuff goes for when you put it back together again. There's a couple things we're going to have to set as we put it back together, like float height and the mixture screw and whatnot. There are some preliminary instructions in the booklet there, but we'll go over that. The tools, obviously, that you need to put it back together are the same tools you use to take it apart. So I've got some needle nose, flat screwdrivers, and the 2 sockets that I use for the float needle and the float needle seat and the main jet. And then I've got my rebuild kit all laid out. So when I'm done with this carburetor, I should have half of this stuff left. I'm going to reuse my float needle and seat because I bought some better aftermarket ones before, and I'm going to just reuse my good ones and save those as spares. One thing I did notice, the colors on here are not necessarily what you're going to look for. So they are actually different each side, just slightly. So you want to look for the piece that lines up with the one that you took out, not necessarily the color that lines up with what you took out, because for mine, the white piece in the kit lines up with this one, which is black. So I'm going to make sure that I put in the correct shape, not obviously the color that might or might not be wrong. So now that we've got everything all laid out, we can and cleaned up and everything, we can start reassembly with just a little bit of light oil on the different parts, and we'll get to that in a second. All right, let's start with the reassembly here. I got just some 020 motor oil. It doesn't really matter. I thought about using ATF as well. It's going to get washed away within the first couple minutes of you running the carb with the fuel through it anyway, so this is literally just to help things go together a little bit more smoothly. There's a couple different ways you could reassemble it. I'm going to go ahead and start with the hard part, which is the linkages. Of the 2 linkages, the choke linkage actually has to go together first because the throttle linkage actually uses part of the choke linkage for its pivot points or for its spring seats. So we'll get to that afterwards. So right down here I've got all of the different parts of the choke laid out. The only part I'm missing is a seal. I've got all of my actual parts up here, so I'll just grab that as I need it. We've got the O-ring already installed on part of the choke mechanism right here. There is no, this is an interference fit, so if it's not fitting or rotating correctly, you want to clean this up a little bit. Mine had a couple of ridges on this part right here, so I just kind of used some 1500 grit sandpaper to kind of twist it back and forth and clean it up. So we're going to start by just lightly oiling that piece and slotting it into the other piece, making sure that it turns nice and freely. There is a seal that actually goes in between the enrichment mechanism here and the body of the carburetor, and you can tell which way it goes because there's a tiny little divot in there, and that part of the unit goes towards the top, so the place where it indexes on the screw is on the top side, not the bottom side. And that matters because that controls where that little hole is. It also matters which direction this plate is. You're going to have to align this so that these two plates here are towards the throttle blades, because the throttle spring actually indexes right in this slot right here. So make sure this this O-ring here has a smear of oil on it. Make sure that you line up the little divot there with the divot there, and make sure that that goes towards the top retaining screw when you slot it in to the carburetor body, and that'll seat nice and securely in there. You'll actually feel it kind of seat in. Next, there's a seal and a washer that go on the outside here. Remember, the plates here towards the throttle plate, which is going to be in this hole right here, so they're going to go that way. So they're going to drop in like that. We've got the two screws. They're going to go in here to hold this all in place. Next step here is going to be the choke return spring, which the straight part goes in towards the carburetor body and up so that it indexes in the slot in the top there. The hooked part will get hooked around right here. You could try to do that as you put it on, or you can do it later with a pick or something, but that gets pressed down onto the odd shaped end of the enrichment shaft. So once that's seated on there, you can test that the spring is seated properly and functioning. It gets one of those weird tooth washer things that just slots on there, and then your the shaft nut, or whatever you want to call this thing, it has to go on with the threaded side towards the carburetor, or it will obviously not seat properly. So we're gonna get that tightened up. Okay, got the right size socket for that, 7/16. Tighten this down so that now there is no in and out play in the choke mechanism. If there is, you'll end up with a choke that either works way too well or works all the time or doesn't work at all. So again, we just test functionality of the spring, make sure it's got the right tension on it, and then once that's all set, ready to go, just grab a screwdriver and bend these tabs up a little bit so that it can't back its way out. Now, next we're going to assemble the throttle linkage, but in order to have the throttle linkage assembled, we need to have something to connect the throttle linkage to. So the throttle shaft and butterfly valve need to go in next. I lucked out, my carburetor was actually okay, and I didn't need to ream out the seat for the throttle shaft and press the new bushings in. It checked out. There's no play in the throttle shaft at all. So there's going to be seals for both sides of the throttle shaft, but what actually holds it in place is having the butterfly valve attached to it, and it slots through here and gets attached with 2 screws. The poppet valve here goes with the flat side in towards the engine, so this way. So we're just going to give the throttle shaft a very light skim coat of oil so that it slides in and seats properly. Make sure that the flat edges and the threaded side go towards the linkage so that you have something to hook the linkage to. So we're going to slide this in here like this. Then we're going to take our butterfly valve or throttle valve, and we're going to slide it in there like so, and it won't actually turn unless you have it perfectly lined up. So you're going to monkey with a little bit until it seats like that. Then you can press the seal in on this side and on that side, and you can put the 2 screws in. Now when you put the 2 screws in, they're actually special screws, and they have a tiny little slot in the back side. And what that's for is so that once it's in, you can bend the ends of the screw out ever so slightly so that it can't just walk its way out and find its way into the inside of your engine. So we're going to grab a little screwdriver. We're going to tighten these down. I am not actually going to splay those ends out yet. I want to make sure that my carburetor is completely good to go, the rebuild's complete, and then I'll worry about splaying those ends out, because if I mess something up, if something goes wrong, if I want to take it apart and check something, and I've spread those ends out, that's it, I'm done. I cannot go back and fix that. So you want to make sure that you wait until you're sure. Now you can see here there's no play in my throttle shaft, so I didn't have to put the new bushings in, ream it out. So you got the seals here. You get one that goes on either end. I'm just going to use a socket to press them on uniformly, but I'm definitely going to just put a little bit of light oil on there before I press the seal on. I'm going to put the seal on the other side as well. Make sure that it is seated, and then we'll move on to the linkage. Seals are seated. Moving on to the linkage. The first part of the linkage is going to be this plate right here, and you have to make sure that you orient it correctly. The spring is going to hold the throttle closed, obviously, so when you go to set this up, that's how you're going to want to set it up, with the throttle blade closed. I'm not sure if you can do it a different way. I'm not going to try. So it's going to go on there like that. So after that, the linkage indexing plate's going to go on. After that, I'm just going to thread my idle air screw in until it touches. If you haven't already done it, one thing that I really recommend doing is replacing the set nut setup on your idle air screw with these little springs. It makes tuning way easier, because you don't have to slacken off a nut and then adjust it and then try and tighten it without screwing up your adjustments and whatnot. So just get yourself some little spring set from the hardware store and get that taken care of while you have it all apart. After that, we've got the spacer. After the spacer, we've got our little toothed washer to hold everything in place. After the toothed washer, this nut goes on. So folding the little tabs up, so that we can get our throttle spring on here. The hooked part of the throttle spring goes away from the carb body. So this hooked part goes away from the carb body and towards the top. It actually indexes on the little slot there in that top plate. Now, if you remember correctly, we actually need to wrap it around the whole time in order to get the proper tension. So just make sure you're paying attention to that when you go to set this back in. The back of the spring just indexes on that choke plate, retaining plate, which is why we had to install the choke first, because otherwise that would not have lined up. So I'm gonna get this wound around the proper amount of times and hooked into the little groove there, and that will be it for the linkage on this carburetor. Quick side-by-side, because I'm gonna say that yes, it does matter. So if you see here on the new carburetor, you probably can't see it on the video, but there actually is a ever so small gap around the edges of that throttle plate, which is going to cause you nightmares when you try and set your idle. If you look at this one, the throttle plate has a slot in it, and there's no way you can see that, but it has a slot in it that indexes on the little fast idle, or the little idle port. So we're going to need to pull that other one back apart, and unfortunately we're going to have to file, cut, mill, somehow add that little relief into the new throttle plate so that it seats properly and doesn't foul on the idle port there. And the other way that I was able to tell that that was going to be an issue is if you look at the throttle linkage here, it actually is not closing the whole way. This, the bracket here that houses the idle air screw is noticeably higher off the stop than on the original carburetor because of the gap around the throttle plate there. Now you can see it from this back side here. You can see the ring of light around the carburetor, around that throttle plate. So this is exactly why I didn't splay the ends of the screws out yet. So we're going to take it all back apart, fix that issue, and we'll go from there. Just a quick note on how I solved my throttle plate issue, and this is why you never throw any old parts away until the new parts are installed. So even though I butchered the crap out of the old throttle plate removing it, what I was able to do is take the old throttle plate, put two M4 screws through here, machine screws with nuts on the back, and attach it to the old throttle plate to index this notch in the top of the throttle blade, the bottom of the throttle blade, I guess. And then I had a file that was the perfect width, and I ran it over this area a couple times to get the right profile of this groove to match the old throttle plate. And then I just pulled the screws out and slotted it into the carburetor here, and actuated the throttle to check that everything lined up, and it actually worked out really well. So if you need the ones with the slot for the idle port and you didn't get them, that's an easy way to make sure that the port is lined up exactly, the slot is lined up exactly with the port. just go ahead and use the old throttle blade as a template, and that'll help you get it all lined up. And we're back. So after disassembling all of this, filing the groove in the throttle blade at the bottom there for the idle port, you can see now that the idle air screw and that plate is much closer to the stop, and that's the way it should be. So this is why you got to check things twice. Don't take things at face value. Don't ever say, oh, well, I guess that's just the way it is if something seems a little bit off. Double check things, figure out why things aren't going back together the right way. And as you can see, now we do not have that ring of light around the throttle blade. It's seating properly and has the little gap down at the bottom for the idle port. So we are good to go, good to move on to the next step. We're going to move on now to the bottom of the carburetor. So here is your main jet. Before you slot that in, it needs to get one of these aluminum washers out of the kit. So that's going to seat in a groove that is around there. So it's going to be difficult to get it in just because it's got a seat pretty securely in that groove. So a little oil and kind of slowly work it down over. If you need to, find the right size socket and use that to kind of help you press it on evenly. And there we go. 7/16 socket again, by the way, for the win. Again, just some light oil. Doesn't really matter that much, but this is going to seat down in there like that and be held in place with the same retaining nut that you took off of there, obviously. And that one is a 5/8 socket. Next, we're going to move on to the float needle and seat. Like I said, I am actually reusing mine because I bought better aftermarket ones. Although the ones that come in the kit are the Viton tipped needle and seat. They are not the plastic ones. It looks like they're probably an aluminum bodied, which I still don't like. I don't think it returns properly, and you'll end up overflowing the carb. So what I've got here is a nice squared off heavy brass one, spring loaded, and the matching seat. And this is, to me, this is just the better quality one. It costs next to nothing from any of the normal retailers, so why on earth not? So we're just gonna screw the jet, or the seat in for the float needle, and that gets tightened up with a 5/16 socket, and don't have to wrench the crap out of it, just snug it up. Not trying to kill it here. Take your float needle, and that just gets dropped in there. Next up, we're going with the float itself. Now the float itself is held in place with this float pin right here, the pivot pin that we took out obviously before. So just a very light coat of oil on that, and it only threads in from one side, so it's not like you can put it in backwards. The float only goes in one way, I believe. They actually made it that way so that it indexes in the bowl. It has to index around that screw hole, so it's not possible for you to stick the thing in upside down, which is a nice feature. So we're going to feed the pivot through the float and seat it into the other side of the carburetor, and we're just going to tighten this up. This pivot point does have a washer. It does not have a seal. There's no seal on the float pin, but it does get an aluminum washer that comes in the kit. This guy right here, it's gonna go on like that. So not a seal necessarily, but gets the washer in there. And then get it to seat in there. Perfect. And we'll tighten this up. And now we get to the fun part, setting float height. It's actually really easy. All you're going to need is some form of a straight edge that you can sit across the carburetor right here, and some way to measure distance to the float. I've got one of these, like literally $2 or $3 Harbor Freight things, calipers. It's just a slide caliper. There's no dial, no nothing. We're just measuring the float height. Now what you do is make sure that it's, you know, gravity is holding the float down in the float body, and just tap it a couple times to make sure it's seated properly. What you're going to do at this point is you're going to take a straight edge of some sort, a ruler, a square, just something that's a straight edge. And of course I'm unprepared and don't have anything, so I'm going to use the throttle shaft, but you're going to set the straight edge right across here, and then you're going to measure down to the float. And the measurement from your straight edge to the float should be 1 millimeter. Now, it says in the instructions plus or minus half a millimeter, so it really is not, it's not going to ruin the way your car runs if it's off by a little bit. So shoot for 1 millimeter from the straight edge to the float as near as you can. The way you adjust it then, if it's off, is by bending up or pushing down on this little tab here where it touches the needle. So you just pull it up a little bit. If you need it to sit lower, you push it down a little bit. If you need it to sit higher, and then each time you kind of monkey with the float to get it to move around, and then you double check with the caliper or the ruler or however you're doing it. All right, the next step we have is to assemble the main jet, the bimetallic thermal compensator, and the mixture screw. So a couple things to note here is that you want to make sure that your main jet moves freely in the guide here. Like this should just slide in and out nice and smoothly. I added just a little bit of light oil, but there should be no interference here whatsoever, because if there is, your mixture screw will actually have a hard time moving the main jet up and down, and it will go richer, but it will not go leaner when you turn it that way. The other thing to know is that it's always easier to index the main jet into the bimetallic thermal compensator before you stick it into the carburetor, because you're never going to try and weasel this around there once it's installed. So you just want to go ahead, feed that up through, and then all you want to do is make sure that it is in that groove on the side, because that's what allows it to move it up and down. Again, you're not necessarily matching color for color with this this main jet. You're matching it for appearance, because it has to line up a certain way with the plate here, and it also has to align a certain way to the bottom plate to the float bowl, which we'll get to in a second. So that just slots right down in there. Again, make sure it's moving freely. The plate for the bimetallic thermal compensator actually rides on a couple of little bosses cast into the carb body right there, and that's its pivot point to move up and down. It moves up and down on this screw right here that has this shoulder or collar on it, whatever you want to call it, and it also has tension placed on it by this spring. So that all has to be assembled in the right order, and that would be with that going down through the body into there. And this is not something that you can over tighten. I'm not saying go ham and crank it down like crazy, but because of that collar on the screw, you tighten this thing until it stops. You're not worried about the screw tension setting tension on the spring. Once this hits its point right there, that it stops, that's it. That's the proper tension on the spring, because that collar has hit the carb body and you cannot tighten it anymore. Don't wrench on it. You'll strip the threads out of the thing. So what we have now is this bimetallic thermal compensator is indexed on the main jet and can move up and down. However, as of now, there's nothing to move it up and down. So the next thing is we're going to rotate this body around. We're going to grab a seal, tiny little baby seal, out of our kit, lube it up with just a little bit of oil, and put it onto our mixture screw. Voila. That didn't take me 2 minutes, I promise. It was lickety split. So your mixture screw is then going to slot in there and get screwed in. Now, as you screw this in, you can watch and actually see the bimetallic thermal compensator moving up and down. Well, as you're tightening it, it's going to move up, which is going to pull the main jet down. Okay, now adjusting the mixture screw for like a base setting. I've looked for this information everywhere and nobody can tell you what the actual base setting is, except in the book. It tells you. Now, it's very difficult to do this with the carburetors mounted to the car, so it's much better if we can go ahead and get this set now, and it'll give us a baseline for tuning. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look inside the bore here, and that straight line that's running back and forth across in there is called the bridge. So what we want to do is we want to adjust the mixture screw until the top of the main jet right here is flush with the bridge. It's going to be almost impossible to put a straight edge in there, but if you stuck a straight edge in there, you want it to be flush with the bridge there. So once it's flush with the bridge, you're going to turn it down, which is rich, so you turn it to the right, 2 full turns. So 1/2 1, 1/2 2. And that is going to be the default setting for getting your baseline for tuning and whatnot. So it's flush with the bridge, stick some kind of a straight edge down in there and confirm that it's flush with the bridge, and then rich or to the right or down, however you want to think of it, 2 full turns. So that's the default setting for your jet, your main jet height. Obviously, once you get it on the car and once you start tuning it and whatnot, that's all gonna be adjusted, but that's the good starting place for having everything adjusted properly. Additionally, this idle screw here, what they say is that you want it to be just clear of the stop, so it hasn't, just to where it hasn't adjusted the throttle plate at all, and then you're going to want to tighten that one single turn. So clockwise, one single turn, and that's going to give you your base setting for the throttle adjustment for your idle screw. Next, we're going to finish the reassembly on the float bowl here, now that everything's adjusted, tightened up, set, good to go. So we're going to take this float bowl, we've got our seal here that goes in that ring. I have in the past put a sealant on that, like a fuel safe sealant. If you're using a brand new gasket, that should not be necessary. So I'm just going to slot that into the base here, and you can see that it does stick up just proud of the slot, which means it should get a nice, good, positive seal. Just throwing just a little bit of oil around there to help it seal properly. Now, the cool thing about this bottom plate is that there's only one way it can go on. So it's got a little tab there and a little tab there. They go away from the float pivot. That's the only way they can go in. You can't put it in wrong. So I'm going to line it up there, throw it in there, and then the screws go back in the bottom here. Okay, now that we've got the float bowl reassembled and all the screws back in, we're going to flip it over and we're going to finish the assembly of the top. So a couple things that we have to reassemble on the top would be the piston and that needle, the main needle, and then the piston lifting spring and piston right here. So this piston here, there's a large side, kind of like a baseball bat, and a small side. The large side goes towards the top. The small side is going to slot through and go to the bottom. Then on the bottom, it's going to be held in place with that tiny spring that I really hope you didn't lose, and that tiny little C-clip that I also hope you didn't lose. So the spring is going to go on there. It's probably easier to slot the pin down through the spring. And then this is where those needle nose pliers come in handy, because you're going to have to grab your tiny little C-clip here. Take your tiny little C-clip, grab it with your needle nose pliers, and then you're going to have to compress the spring without pushing the piston up in the bore, or the pin up in the bore, and then you're going to have to stick that little C-clip into its groove and slot it home. That C-clip does not come in the kit, so if you lose it, sorry. All right, we're on the home stretch for the first carburetor. After you've got that piston lifting device, you're going to want to turn it back over to the top side. Next thing that goes in is going to be the guide for the piston. That just goes right back into the hole that you pulled it out of on the air side of the carburetor, not the throttle side of the carburetor. That screw and that tiny little piece are not included in any of the kits, so you're just going to reuse your old one, and it's not a super critical part. It just essentially indexes the piston in the bore so that it tracks true up and down. Now, there are reasons for where it tracks in there to deal with the the way air flows. So if you see, this is the groove that indexes with that part we just put in, and there are some holes for vacuum and whatnot that are you know, indexed a certain way. So next we're going to go ahead and just a tiny bit of light oil around the bore here and around the piston there, and just kind of just light lubrication. You're not trying to stick a ton of oil on this. Slot the needle down into the main jet, which is dark in there, you can't see, but, and the piston follows. Make sure that it moves freely up and down, it doesn't snag, it doesn't grab. Don't forget your spring here, your big old piston spring. That's going to go up top there like that. And then the last part here is that we're going to take our dash pot cover and it's going to go on top. Now the cool thing about that is that it can only go one way. So it's not like you can line it up wrong, like it doesn't line up there. There it is. So all three holes only line up if you have it in the right orientation. So once that's done, these screws go back in. You got the two plain screws in the front, and if you're lucky enough to still have it, the one in the back is going to have your little carburetor tag with the specific information for your carburetor. If your carburetor has been rebuilt before, the likelihood of that being still in existence is not as great. But so we're just gonna go around and tighten these. Now remember, when we started this whole process, we poured oil out of the dash pot at the top of the carburetor. So you will need to add the correct amount of oil back in so that it flows, the piston flows up and down smoothly and doesn't is not too jerky in its motion. What I've heard is the correct level, and again, you gotta love forums, and they'll give you 153 different answers about what to put into the dash pot and how much to put in. The how much is pretty much universally agreed that when the piston is inserted into the dash pot, you want approximately 1/4 of an inch of fluid above the top of the piston. How you tell that, I have no idea, but that's what they say is pretty much recognized as the fluid level. As far as what fluid, I've heard everything from hydraulic oil to the same oil you put in the engine to 80-90 gear oil to automatic transmission fluid. It does have a minor effect on tuning. So if you try something and it doesn't seem like it's working properly, maybe go with a slightly thicker or thinner oil. A thicker oil is going to further dampen the movement of this piston up and down in the bore. A thinner oil is going to dampen it a little bit less, so the piston will move up and down more freely. And that kind of affects throttle response as far as if you really romp on it quickly, does it just fly open with not very much damping, or does it kind of slide open and give you a more linear throttle response? And that's kind of up to the driving style that you do and how you use your little British car. So we're gonna, for now, I'm just gonna put a light coating of oil on the tip of this so that it's not going in dry. And the gasket for this, there is one in the kit, or you could reuse the one that came with it. Doesn't matter. But I will add the proper fluid to that later. And there you go. That is one SU HIF 4 carburetor rebuilt. We'll do something else a little later with the linkage, because the linkage, as you put it back on the vehicle, has to index into these nuts that we assembled, and it indexes onto slots in the plates and whatnot. So we'll worry about that when we remount them to the car, and we'll get to that a little later. But for now, that is reassembly on one SU HIF 4 carburetor.